On November 9th and 10th, 1938, the Nazi regime in Germany carried out the infamous November pogrom, Kristallnacht, the night of shattered glass. 400 Jews were murdered or driven to suicide, more than 1,400 synagogues and 7,500 Jewish businesses and homes were destroyed. Jewish cemeteries were desecrated. In the days that followed, 30,000 Jewish men were transported to concentration camps. Did this pogrom materialize out of thin air? Of course not. Anti-Semitism was nothing new to Germany nor to Europe, and most of the 1930s saw marginalizing of Jews, stripping them of rights, and subjecting them to violence. According to the Jewish Museum of Berlin, for years already, the Nazi regime had been pursuing a plan of forcibly expropriating Jews, and in particular, Aryanizing Jewish businesses to finance Germany's rearmament process. And then, of course, there was a spark that lit the fuse, a pretext to justify attacks on Jews in the minds of those itching to punish them for the crime of simply existing in Germany. The scapegoating came in the form of 17-year-old Herschel Greenspan, who on 7 November 1938 shot German diplomat Ernst von Rath, who died of his injuries 2 days later. The Jewish Museum's website writes the following: "The assassination provided a welcome pretext to strike out against the Jewish population with unprecedented brutality. Nazi propaganda portrayed the violence as an outbreak of, quote, spontaneous national rage. Of course, as we know, it was the exact opposite, an orchestrated attack by Hitler and Goebbels, by the SA and SS, with popular support from a willing public." I share the story of Kristallnacht because for me it was the beginning of my own paternal family's immigration story. The day my grandfather's home was ransacked and he escaped, eventually joining his sister in Chicago. He was accepted to this country as a refugee, fleeing oppression and seeking to build a better life in America. The US did not make it easy. There was rampant anti-Semitism in the State Department that blocked so many Jews from escaping in the years when that was still possible, but he did come, and I'm here because of it. I want to touch on the theme of immigration today. And truth be told, I hesitated to share the story at all. First, because drawing Holocaust analogies is really almost never a good idea. In considering our American response to the recent and inexcusable DC shooting of Staff Sergeant Andrew Wolf and the murder of Specialist Sarah Beckstrom, there will be some who want to claim some sort of parity between these acts or types of acts, that these two young men and their actions nearly 90 years apart were equally culpable of taking lives or equally innocent because of the geopolitical context in which they came to their violent acts. I want to caution us against drawing these types of connections, these comparisons between someone like Herschel Greenspan or Ramanullah Lochinwall. They are different people. The national and historical contexts are far from identical. The sociological question of what societal conditions help to breed violence, or when or against whom violence might be justified, that's an interesting question, but it's not one that I feel prepared to address at this time. Now, I share the story of Kristallnacht because I'm interested in how societies relate to outsiders, how they can weaponize racist tropes against foreigners, including when those so-called foreigners are legal residents, citizens even. I'm not going to restate today my specific concerns about Ernst Frankel's normative and prerogative states and how I fear this framework is increasingly relevant to America today. That sermon from Yom Kippur last is online if you want to review it. What I'd like to consider today is what we might do when faced with the erosion of basic democratic norms and civil legal protections, when minority populations are subject to leaders or citizens from the majority making blanket claims about their own insecurity, while asserting blanket condemnations of entire populations that they consider to be, well, garbage. Beyond important and necessary legal challenges, beyond op-eds and protests, what are some nonviolent tools available to us to push back against scapegoating of victims, of migrants, rather, of racist and xenophobic rhetoric condemning the cultures of entire countries and their millions upon millions of inhabitants and expatriates? Years ago, at the height of the Me Too era, I gave a sermon on Parashat Vayishlach, this week's Parsha, about the rape of Dinah. I spoke of a tarbut ra'ah, the Talmud's term to describe a culture of pervasive tolerance, even permissiveness, surrounding bad behavior. I suggested then that Jacob's silence on the rape of his daughter may have been reflective of that culture, the tendency to blame women for sexual violence or undervalue considerations of consent. Here we are now, 8 years later, and Stephen Miller is claiming the tarbut ra'ah, the irredeemably wicked culture, is that of Afghanistan, of Sudan, of Somalia. You are not just importing individuals, Miller tweeted on Thanksgiving, for God's sake. You are importing societies. No magic transformation occurs when failed states cross borders. At scale, migrants and their descendants recreate the conditions and terrors of their broken homelands. To be clear, I don't disagree that these are in many ways failed societies. The brutality in Sudan is horrific. The Taliban's totalitarian oppression of women and dissidents is terrifying, which is why our Afghan neighbors selling their wares at the boutique here last Sunday are here in the United States because of those conditions in Afghanistan. But how Miller justifies his own family's immigration story and American success after his great-grandparents fled Tsarist pogroms, I have no idea. Does he honestly think the Nazi Germany from which my grandfather escaped was anything other than a failed state? By such logic, am I and my children somehow tainted by the tarbut ra'ah, the societal rot that forced Grandpa Montrose to flee, that caused the extermination of 2/3 of European Jewry? Orwell himself would be hard-pressed to imagine a more Orwellian inversion. I am deeply concerned about global terror and how it affects Jewish communities around the world. But I would submit that if there is a tarbut ra'ah, a pervasively dangerous culture that threatens America urgently at this moment, it is in fact the increasing normalization of nativism, of white nationalism, of anti-Semitism and anti-Israelism, of racism, sexism, Islamophobia, and more. In Parashat Noach, there's a famous debate about Noah. Was he truly blameless? Was he a hero for having been a good man against the backdrop of a failed society? Or was he only blameless, quote unquote, in comparison to those around him? And no matter the answer to that really interesting question, the implication of such a debate is that it is quite difficult to buck a trend, to be good when bad behavior surrounds us. That's the danger of a tarbut ra'ah. It's one the characters of our parsha this week in Vayishlach contend with as well. Not long after the rape of Dinah narrative, and just before Rachel tragically dies in childbirth while delivering her son Benjamin, the Torah offers an enigmatic passage. V'tamot Deborah meneket Rivka. Deborah, Rebecca's nurse, died. V'tikaver mitachat leveit el tachat ha'alon, and was buried under the oak below Beth El. Vayikra shmo Alon Bachut, and so it was named Alon Bachut. Who was this Deborah? In the text, Our text, where we infrequently hear details of women's lives, let alone the particulars of their deaths, why would the Torah take time to tell us about Rebekah's nurse? The 13th century Catalonian sage Ramban suggests the verse is not really about Deborah at all. Drawing from Breshit Rabbah, from the Midrash, he writes, "For the weeping and anguish could not have been such for the passing of the old nurse that the place would have been named on account of it. Instead, Jacob wept and mourned for his righteous mother, who had loved him and sent him to Padan Aram, and who was not privileged to see when he returned." Nachmanides is noticing that we're never actually told about Rebekah's death in the Torah, and so Deborah becomes a stand-in, a way of indicating to the reader that Rivka has in fact passed away. But Rashi in Toi, 2 centuries earlier, thinks different. He reminds us that decades earlier, after Jacob bargained for Esau's birthright and stole his brother's blessing, Esau wanted to kill him. So Jacob fled to Haran, to the house of Rebekah's brother, Lavan. V'shalachti v'lakachticha misham, she says, "I will send and fetch you from there once your brother's anger dies down." Jacob, of course, stays a long time. He stays for 20 years. And the question is, does Rebekah actually follow through? Does she send for him? According to Rashi, in the name of his teacher Moshe HaDarshan, she does in the form of her maid Deborah. But the real question is, why does it take so long to leave? If it's true that they sent Deborah along, why there 20 years? What is happening in Haran that kept Jacob there? We know his uncle Lavan is manipulative. We know that he switches his daughters under the chuppah, as it were, that he compels Jacob to work for him for 14 years. But the Midrash suggests something even more sinister was going on, that the household of Lavan and his father Betuel before him was a tarbut ra'ah, a depraved culture. One Midrash argues that the reason they try to hold Rebekah for 10 days before allowing her to depart with Abraham's servant is related to the reason Lavan, a generation later, delays Jacob's departure. What was really going on with his positioning of his daughters in that particular way? This was, says the Midrash, a household that abused women. In Rebekah's case, the Midrash in Yalkut Shimoni suggests that Betuel, king of Haran, had introduced jus prima noctis, a custom granting lords the so-called right of the first night with a virgin bride, before she is given to her husband. Betuel, and then his son Lavan after him, were about to exercise that quote-unquote right before God intervenes and Rebekah is able to flee to Canaan with Abraham's servant and her own nurse by her side. This midrashic tradition, very troubling though it is probably what Rabbi Yosef Ber Soloveitchik, the 20th century leader of Yeshiva University, has in mind when he posits an intriguing theory about Deborah, the maid who Rashi says goes back home to fetch Jacob, who spends decades with him and who is honored with a burial in today's Torah reading. Apparently, he writes, Deborah played a major role in shaping the history and destiny of the Jewish people. How so, you might ask? Deborah, he writes, was the leader of a moral underground movement. The Rav's argument hinges on Rebekah's quality of chesed. Much like the ancient debate about Noah in his time, he asks how someone who is raised in such an abusive household could be so kind. He writes, Rebekah was brought up in the house of Betuel and Lavan in a pagan orgiastic society. How did she exhibit such great humility and chesed? Why was she not influenced by her family and society? There must have been an underground community in Haran preaching Abraham's morality. Rebekah was part of this underground movement. She studied and absorbed Abraham's philosophy and adopted his Weltanschauung, his worldview, living by his principles of justice and righteousness. Deborah, as Rebecca's nurse, he argues, must have been the conveyor of these values. That's why she merits to be named in our Parsha. That's why she's buried at Alon Bachut, the so-called Weeping Oak. She was the Jedi Master. She was the subversive teacher of kindness against the backdrop of her own Tarbut Ra'ah. However, I don't know the extent to which our current circumstances call for an underground movement. As I said, we should be careful to honor distinctions between this political moment in this particular country and others that might serve as cautionary tales. And yet this era is on its face, a dangerous one for many who dwell in this land, most of whom are responsible, hardworking, and fully deserving of the opportunities afforded to my family, Stephen Miller's family, and just about all of yours. I do believe there are things, both public and private, we can be doing to support migrants, including, of course, the many who arrived here lawfully, many of whom have protected status, and some of whom are friends of this congregation. For those of us getting up to speed, or who could use a reminder of the administration's actions following the shooting of Wolf and Beckstrom, the U.S. Customs and Immigration Service issued a new policy memo this past Tuesday, reiterating actions that the agency has been instructed to take. These are: placing on hold all affirmative asylum case decisions, placing on hold all pending applications for immigration benefits. This includes applications for work authorizations and green cards from nationals of the 19 travel ban countries. And third, conducting a re-review of all approved immigration benefits, those requests from nationals of the 19 travel ban countries. Given these circumstances, here are a few specific things that we might do, and with great thanks to Evan Serpic for helping me compile these resources. I'll place some links in the text of my sermon when I post it to my Substack, so I'm not asking you to take notes. I want to tell you about the initiatives and the organizations, and you can go there later for the links if they're helpful. HIAS, the century-old Jewish organization which advocates on behalf of immigrants and refugees, suggests going to Refuge Council USA, rcusa.org, and follow their action alerts. You can also go to congress.gov to contact your elected officials and insist they resist isolationist and racist policies. You might also contact the ACLU, who are mobilizing legal and political advocacy responses. Here are some things we can do locally here in our own neighborhood. Welcome, Yeladim. You can support and or volunteer at Beth Am's weekly produce distribution on Tuesdays, or our Byron McKinney Powell free market on Thursdays, which supports about 100 Afghan migrants living in the neighborhood, as well as other neighbors in need. You can support and or volunteer at the Reservoir Hill House of Peace, which is housing a number of asylum seekers at the moment. They are at 2401 Utah Place, just down the street. You can support and or volunteer with Erica, which is looking for volunteers to co-teach English classes for Afghan women in Reservoir Hill on Tuesday mornings between 9:30 and 11 a.m. I'll put all the contact information when I post this. Citywide, there are a number of things you can do. CASA is a regional organization. It's the largest and most organized local organization providing direct support to migrants under threat. They welcome volunteers, particularly bilingual volunteers or those familiar with the immigration system and financial support. They also offer bystander training so people know how to intervene when neighbors are threatened by ICE. We are in close partnership with Jews United for Justice, JUFJ, who also work with CASA. They're asking people to urge Baltimore County officials in particular not to require law enforcement to cooperate with ICE. And we'll be in Annapolis during the session that starts in January to advocate for a statewide ban on these forced cooperations with ICE. The Esperanza Center is a local organization that does important work in healthcare, education, low-cost immigration, legal services. Finally, The IRC, started by Albert Einstein, the International Rescue Committee, which provides employment services, English classes, case management to help with integration into society. So those are just several of a number of things that we can do, and I hope you'll consider doing them. Let me end with this. I know that many of us feel paralyzed by the volume and range of things coming our way these days. It's easy to get overwhelmed. My suggestion is start small. Pick something you can dedicate real time to. Think about what is the best use of your time as well as the most effective. And remember, a Jewish commitment to the stranger, the foreigner, is both a reflection of our own historical experience as a people who have been shut out or worse from so very many societies and nations. It's also at the core of our Torah text, which reminds us again and again to notice and respond to the ger, the resident alien in our midst. It will take moral communities above ground and perhaps underground to continually remind our country and fellow countrymen who we ought to be. We Jews know what it is to be scapegoated, which I believe means we have an obligation to speak out when we see it happening to others. How do we do that effectively is always a critical question. If only we could ask Deborah of our Parsha, of Soloveitchik's imagination, the underground warrior nurse. I'm sure she would have some ideas for us as well. Meanwhile, we'll do our utmost to do some good in her stead. Shabbat Shalom. Chevra, we are at